Emulation has always been a topic of debate and controversy. From the very inception of the concept, emulation sparked major conflicts between tech companies, and the history of emulation has a magic side with software created by anonymous developers who seem to appear out of nowhere, taking everyone by surprise and disappearing just as quickly, leaving behind waves of controversy. And this cycle has never stopped. Just a few weeks ago, we witnessed the conclusion of the 6-year-long battle between Nintendo and the Yuzu emulator. That's the story of emulation, a story of innovation driven by a handful of developers so talented that their feats, often achieved alone or in pairs, shook the video game industry to its core. Nintendo and Sony were pushed to the brink, forced to resort to weird maneuvers, lawsuits, and their influence to try and curb emulation, rarely with much success, at least legally. Here is the secret and untold history of emulation, how discreet and passionate developers put stars in the eyes of gamers, transforming an entire industry and bringing emulation to the masses, while paying a steep price. Before we start, I just want to let you know that most of the sources I used to create this video are in the description. I'll try to do this for some other videos as well, but I can't promise anything because it takes a lot of time. In the early 1980s, IBM dominated the personal computer market. As a result, most software and even accessories released were designed for IBM computers, commonly referred to as IBM PCs, which stood for personal computer. This made it difficult for competing computers to gain traction, allowing IBM to strengthen its hold on the market week by week. But in March 1983, Compaq launched the Compaq Portable, a computer compatible with IBM PCs. Thanks in part to this compatibility and its attractive price, the Compaq Portable became a commercial success. Naturally, dozens of other companies followed suit, releasing computers compatible with IBM's lineup, known as IBM clones or IBM PC compatibles, challenging IBM's dominance in the market. IBM, seeing this as a threat, filed a lawsuit against Compaq, accusing the company of copying IBM's BIOS. The BIOS, or Basic Input-Output System, is a critical program that runs when you start a computer. It plays key roles like initializing hardware components, loading the operating system, and acting as a bridge between hardware and software, among many other essential functions. IBM claimed that to create a compatible computer, Compaq must have copied its BIOS, which was protected by copyright. However, Compaq argued that they had developed their own BIOS through reverse engineering without copying IBM's code. Essentially, they figured out how IBM's computers worked and wrote their own compatible code. IBM couldn't prove that Compaq had copied anything, and the courts sided with Compaq. The conflict would later serve as a reference point for the legal questions surrounding emulation. Many believe that emulation is legal by drawing parallels to this case, since an emulator is simply a program designed to simulate the behavior of one machine on another. Exactly what happened here. And the 1980s were precisely the time when microcomputers were proliferating and evolving. The problem, however, was that there were numerous brands and models. So when users switched computers, they also lost access to the games and software they had purchased for their previous systems. This led to the rise of emulators, which were sold to make games from previous generations of microcomputers compatible. And this became the primary use of emulators during that decade. Then, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, console emulators began to emerge. A Japanese developer going by the name Haruhisa Udagawa released an experimental Famicom emulator for FM Towns in December 1990. Gradually, other emulators started to appear, such as Pasofami, also for FM Towns, and soon most 8-bit consoles had experimental emulators. These early emulators lacked sound and didn't run very well, but they proved that it was possible. Eventually, the most popular emulator by far was released by Nintendo itself. The Super Game Boy, an accessory for the Super Nintendo, allowed players to play Game Boy games on their TV. It enabled the Super Nintendo to simulate the behavior of a Game Boy, making it an emulator, although in this case, it was hardware emulation. By the mid-1990s, personal computers began slowly gaining popularity, along with the internet. A few emulators started to appear, like iNES, a more advanced NES emulator that gained some recognition, despite costing $35 and only running games at about 60% of their normal speed. Virtual Game Boy appeared in 1995 as a fairly advanced Game Boy emulator, followed by Gen M and Genesis for emulating Sega Genesis games. Emulators gradually multiplied, though they remained niche at the time. When interviewed, many emulator developers expressed frustration with modern games, especially early 3D titles, which they found unimpressive. They also felt that older games weren't receiving the respect they deserved, given their high quality, and couldn't bear the thought of seeing these classics disappear. But in 1996, a rather special emulator appeared on the internet, Nesticle, programmed by Icer Addis. Nesticle was easy to install, free, and worked well on a variety of machines, despite the fact that PC architectures at the time weren't yet standardized. It also took advantage of the capabilities of the machines it ran on. More importantly, Nesticle introduced the use of save states, save points that could be created anywhere in the game, as well as the ability to save gameplay by recording the player's button inputs, resulting in very small file sizes, which was useful at a time when download speeds were slow and expensive. It also had many advanced features like the ability to modify colors or sprites. In short, Nesticle was a revolution in emulation, popularizing many features that would later become standard for emulators. And most importantly, it was free, which was rare at the time since most emulators, like the popular iNES, were not. Of course, it wasn't perfect. There were slowdowns in some games. It was imprecise, and there were bugs and crashes, but it was so far ahead of anything else available that it sparked envy, to the point where Icer Addis, the creator, was hacked, and Nesticle's source code was leaked online by someone in a group called Damaged Cybernetics, hackers who believe that everything should be shared freely, music, video games. It seems that he did that too so the source code could be used to create a Super Nintendo emulator. Because although there were several emulators available for most consoles, one console resisted, the Super Nintendo. The SNES was special because its internal workings weren't well known or documented, and it had unique features like Mode 7, a pseudo 3D rendering mode that was very difficult to emulate. There had been a few attempts with primitive emulators, but none were convincing. Around 1996, a race to emulate the SNES began, with 5 or 6 different projects in the works. One of them was SNES 96, which launched with several features but was very slow, so its creator abandoned it. The following year, ESNES was released for free, but it only ran at 50% of the Super Nintendo's speed and the emulation was very inaccurate. Then the creator of SNES 96 released SNES 97, which was much faster and had better emulation but lacked sound and had graphical issues. Meanwhile, SNES 96 was taken over by another developer who improved it, and eventually SNES 96 and SNES 97 merged to become SNES 9X. This resulted in a much more advanced and accurate emulator, but it wasn't the one that got the initial attention. On October 14th, ZSNES was released, and it was very impressive, making it extremely popular. It was widely recommended because its performance was outstanding. It had sound, fewer bugs, and glitches than its competitors, supported more games, and its only real limitation was that it only worked on a specific architecture, the x86 architecture, which limited its reach. Meanwhile, SNES 9X continued to receive updates, evolve, and build a community of contributors, which eventually allowed it to surpass ZSNES. It's incredible how, in just a few years, emulators went from struggling to run 8-bit games like NES titles to successfully emulating the Super Nintendo and its Mode 7. But at that time, the star of emulation wasn't ZSNES, it was MAME. For several years, arcade game emulators had been created, but the problem was that most arcade games had their own hardware, so a specific emulator had to be created for each game or series of arcade games. MAME, Multiple Arcade Machine Emulator, launched in 1996, unified all of that. Its main objective was to preserve arcade games. MAME was even featured in magazines, with articles highlighting its crucial role in preserving arcade game history. This gave emulation a very positive image. At that time, journalists were encouraging emulation, explaining where to find the best emulators for each console, running emulator reviews, interviewing developers, and urging players to discover the gems of previous console generations. Emulators even appeared on the rare shows about video games. A wave of emulation swept through the gaming world, driven by this positive image, until Sony made it their mission to outright kill emulation.
It's the most popular game machine in the world. Wouldn't it be great if we could play some of those titles too? Well, at Macworld today, Connectix is introducing the virtual game station. It is software. It is software that they're going to sell for $49 that turns your Mac into a Sony PlayStation. It plays a few hundred. It plays a few hundred of the Sony PlayStation games today.
On January 4th, 1999, during Macworld 99, Steve Jobs announced and demonstrated the Virtual Game Station, a PlayStation emulator for Mac. At the peak of PlayStation's popularity, he promised that Mac computers would soon be able to play PlayStation games. The impact of this announcement was immediate. Everyone was talking about it. It was featured in all the magazines of that era, with the promise that Macs were essentially going to become PlayStations. During the event, 3,000 copies of Virtual Game Station were sold in just a few hours. Everyone expected Sony to sue Connectix, the creators of the emulator, but their president, Ray McDonald, was very reassuring, stating that Sony had no reason to sue Connectix since they had violated no copyright or trademark. He pointed to previous rulings in similar cases that showed emulation did not constitute patent infringement. Connectix was confident because they had met with Sony a few months prior to negotiate licensing the PlayStation's BIOS. Sony had hinted that they were impressed and were considering it, but ultimately refused. If what they were doing was illegal, McDonald argued, Sony would have told them during that meeting to stop immediately. Moreover, Virtual Game Station wasn't an emulator that could load ROMs or ISOs, game data files. It required the user to insert a PlayStation game CD into their computer for the emulator to run it. Of course, as you can imagine, hackers released patches to bypass this protection, but that wasn't Connectix doing. They were careful not to encourage piracy. However, it seemed that Sony was taken by surprise by the massive success of Virtual Game Station. The sales were so strong that Connectix announced they were preparing a Windows version aimed at a much larger audience than just Mac users. This led Sony to sue Connectix, seeking a preliminary injunction to suspend the emulator's release until the trial, set for the following year. However, on February 5, 1999, the U.S. court denied Sony's request for a preliminary injunction, ruling that emulators were not illegal, so there was no reason to grant the injunction. Sony then took a different approach, filing an appeal with a federal judge, accusing Virtual Game Station of tarnishing the PlayStation brand and the games themselves, arguing that the emulator ran games at a lower quality, with an inconsistent frame rate, averaging around 80% of the original speed. And this worked. On April 22, 1999, Sony was granted a preliminary injunction. Virtual Game Station was pulled from stores, leaving Connectix shocked, calling the ruling unfair. But Sony's troubles were far from over, because Virtual Game Station wasn't the only PlayStation emulator. There were others like PS-EMU and Psych, though they were not very polished. But more notably, in early 1999, a beta of an emulator called Bleem leaked online. Initially thought to be fake, but it shocked everyone. A demo was released on March 21, 1999, and it immediately stood out because Bleem was a stunning emulator. It was more performant than Virtual Game Station and ran on a much wider range of machines, even on older hardware. The minimum specifications were quite low, and this emulator, coupled with Virtual Game Station's buzz, made a lot of noise. In fact, the president of Bleem gave a major interview with IGN, stating that Sony had no reason to sue Bleem because everything had been done legally, and they had all the necessary proof. Like Virtual Game Station, Bleem required users to insert PlayStation game CDs, so it didn't encourage piracy either. Bleem was truly impressive because a renowned developer, Randy Linden, was behind it. Linden had programmed numerous emulators in the past, such as Commodore 64 emulators for the Amiga, and he had also created the impressive port of Doom for the Super Nintendo. On a whim, he decided to program a PlayStation emulator for PC. However, like Connectix, Sony sued Bleem on April 2, 1999. Unlike Connectix, which had been around since the early 90s and had a decent number of employees, Bleem was a tiny company made up of just a few people, so it seemed unlikely they would withstand Sony's legal onslaught. Yet, just 2 days later, Bleem announced they would go to court and fight Sony. Sony again tried to get an injunction to ban the emulator before the trial, but the US court denied it for a specific reason. The main reason Sony succeeded in getting an injunction against Virtual Game Station was that they proved the emulator degraded the quality of games, running them at an average of 80% of their original speed. That wasn't the case with Bleem. Not only did Bleem run PlayStation games at full speed, but it also improved the visual quality of the games with higher resolutions, anti-aliasing, and other enhancements that made the games look better on PC. Sony continued to file appeals, but they were rejected. Bleem was here to stay, and they even had a booth at E3 1999, causing a sensation. It was one of the biggest surprises of the event. Sony tried to force Bleem's booth to be removed, but nothing worked. A tiny company of just a few people was shaking the multinational Sony. In its first month, Bleem sold 50,000 units, which was impressive for a PC product at the time. This was a disaster for Sony because 1999 was the year they were promoting the PlayStation 2, one of whose biggest selling points was its backward compatibility with PlayStation 1 games. Having an emulator that made those games look better on PC and that worked on most machines undermined their image and strategy, especially since Bleem was hugely popular and being talked about everywhere. And it wasn't just Sony facing difficulties. On January 26, 1999, a Nintendo 64 emulator emerged out of nowhere. At that time, there were frequent fake Nintendo 64 emulators that contained viruses, and there had been previous attempts to emulate the Nintendo 64, such as Project Unreality, which couldn't even get games to boot. So no one believed it at first, but very quickly people realized the emulator wasn't a virus, and it soon became legendary because it achieved the unthinkable. It managed to run Nintendo 64 games at their original speed while boosting the resolution up to 4 times higher than the console's original resolution. This happened just as Ocarina of Time was breaking sales records, and the emulator allowed people to play these games with stunning graphics. On top of that, given that screens at the time were smaller, the high resolution made the games look even more beautiful. The emulator was called Ultra HLE, and it was a seismic event in the gaming world. Everyone was shocked by what it brought to the table. It received full-page coverage in magazines, and its name became famous in a matter of days. Reports suggested hundreds of thousands of downloads within the first 2 weeks, which was astonishing. Ultra HLE revolutionized emulation by popularizing a new technique, reflected in its name, Ultra High-Level Emulation. At the time, emulators were designed to replicate a console by recreating each component of the machine independently, with each process handled by its own hardware. This approach provided very accurate emulation because the processes mirrored those of the original console, but it was also very slow and not optimized, referred to as low-level emulation. Ultra HLE took a different approach. It emulated the Nintendo 64's central processor in a traditional manner, but for everything else, it intercepted the instructions sent by the processor and translated them into simpler commands for the graphics cards of the time. This made the emulation much faster because it was optimized for PC hardware. The trade-off was less precision, and patches were needed for some games. However, Ultra HLE wasn't designed to run all Nintendo 64 games, but focused on a select few, particularly popular titles like Mario 64 and Zelda, which was why it could deliver such impressive performance. This shift was facilitated by rapid advancements in computer hardware towards the end of the 90s, particularly in 3D graphics cards from NVIDIA, Voodoo, and 3DFX, which were far superior to the graphics capabilities of consoles designed in 1993 to 1994. The same rapid progress was seen in processors with the proliferation of Intel's Pentium chips. This marked a significant change in emulation. Previously, emulators were primarily used for historical purposes, running outdated consoles and appealing to retro enthusiasts, but now, new emulators were not only replicating current consoles, but also enhancing game graphics, leading to an astonishing evolution from emulating the NES to running Nintendo 64 games. Naturally, this drove the console manufacturers crazy. Sony continued its relentless legal actions against Bleem, and Ultra HLE's rapid rise in popularity caught Nintendo's attention. Shortly after its release, Nintendo of America publicly expressed their intention to pursue legal action, furious over the emulator's impact and claiming it encouraged piracy and violated patents. Despite removing the emulator from their site and halting its development, Ultra HLE's distribution continued. On February 12, 2000, one of the most crucial legal battles in gaming history took place: Kinetics versus Sony. The American court ruled entirely in favor of Kinetics and their emulator, rejecting all of Sony's claims. This landmark decision not only allowed Kinetics to continue selling their emulator, but also set a clear precedent that video game emulation was legal. Sony's attempt to have the Supreme Court reconsider was also denied, solidifying the legitimacy of emulation. Soon after this case, Bleem announced Bleemcast, an emulator for the Dreamcast that could run PlayStation games. This was remarkable, as Bleem managed to create an emulator for Sega's latest console, bypassing protections and promising enhanced graphics. Sony was enraged, leading to more aggressive legal measures. They acquired Virtual Game Station from Kinetics to shut it down and pressured retailers to remove Bleem products by threatening to cut off PlayStation 2 supplies, just like what they did to Xbox at the time too, as it was reported in magazines. This aggressive strategy had immediate effects. Bleem was strangled by exorbitant legal fees and lost retailer support, leading to its downfall. As Bleem's president lamented, "They've managed to keep us in court for nearly 2 years, costing close to $2 million in legal fees and public money for the courts. They simply say, 'We think Bleem infringes on some intellectual property rights,' and leave it at that, with no one having the courage to challenge them further." Meanwhile, Sony and Nintendo ramped up their efforts to shut down sites hosting ROMs of their games. In the same year, a well-known site for ROMs, davesclassics.com, was shut down by the IDSA. Sony and Nintendo frequently highlighted this in the media, leading to widespread coverage and a negative shift in the perception of emulation. As illustrated by a leading editorial from Electronic Gaming Monthly, one of the most read gaming magazines in the US, which claimed emulation was destroying video games, that games should no longer be emulated, and in several surveys, players sided with Sony and not with the emulators. The perception of emulation took a significant hit. It's paradoxical, but while emulation has been declared completely legal, it is at this moment that emulation is frowned upon. It became widely viewed as problematic, and players began distancing themselves from it. And that's something emulation will have a hard time recovering from. After these legal issues, the new generation of consoles arrived and became mainstream, and this time, the problems from the previous generation disappeared. The new consoles were so powerful and had such exotic architecture, especially the PlayStation 2, that they became nearly impossible to emulate. There were attempts, like PCSX2, one of the first PlayStation 2 emulators, which arrived in 2002, but the emulation was pretty terrible, almost unplayable, with games running slowly, crashing, and suffering from graphical issues. The same went for Dolphin, the GameCube emulator, which had similar problems. The only recent console that had a working emulator was the Game Boy Advance, like GBA-EMU, IGBA, Boycott Advance, etc. However, the one that really took over was Visual Boy Advance, thanks to its speed and accuracy. But apart from that, the emulation world slowly died off. No one wanted to spend so much time programming an emulator for a recent console only to risk a lawsuit and face criticism from some gamers who viewed emulators as piracy tools. So for years, emulators became rare and discreet. Gone were the magazine articles or websites with pages dedicated to emulators. Emulation became a taboo topic, and with the Interactive Digital Software Association regularly shutting down ROM sites, emulation was only of interest to a small niche group of gamers, enthusiasts who had done enough research to find their way around it. Often when new emulators appeared, the projects died off relatively quickly. For example, when a French developer called Yop Yop created a DS emulator called DS-EMU, yes, that's how it's pronounced, just 1 year after the console's release, he abandoned the project in 2006, sharing the source code before disappearing. Paradoxically, it was the biggest opponents of emulation who would end up using it themselves. In 2002, Nintendo released The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker on the GameCube, and one of its collector's editions included a disc that allowed players to play Ocarina of Time on the GameCube. And to run Ocarina of Time on the GameCube, Nintendo used an emulator optimized specifically for that game. The same went for Animal Crossing, which allowed players to play NES games via an in-game emulator. But Nintendo took it even further.
Virtual console capable of downloading 20 years of Nintendo content. You will be able to purchase great games originally created for NES, Super NES, and Nintendo 64. It is accurate to say that Nintendo Revolution is technically capable of playing virtually every Nintendo console game ever created.
At E3 2005, Nintendo announced the Virtual Console, which was heavily promoted during the Wii's announcement. One of the big selling points of the Wii was the ability to buy and play a wide range of games from previous consoles. After the Super Game Boy, the Game Boy Player, and the use of emulators within some games, this was something much bigger, emulators for a wide range of previous consoles. Sony followed suit a bit later with the PlayStation Network, offering PlayStation 1 classics on the PlayStation 3 and PlayStation Portable. It's quite ironic. Those who once tried to make emulation illegal demonized it and claimed that playing games on anything other than the original console would harm their image were now the ones offering emulation left and right. This time, however, the emulation was a huge selling point, and the Virtual Console on the Wii was notably successful because Nintendo had taken emulation seriously, providing high-quality emulation. At that time, PC emulators for various consoles like the Nintendo 64 weren't great and supported few games. The same was true for other consoles, but the Virtual Console emulators were excellent. In fact, Nintendo made a surprising choice. They developed a highly comprehensive emulator and optimized it for each individual game. For example, the emulator used for Super Mario 64 was not exactly the same as the one used for Ocarina of Time, resulting in very high-quality emulation. It might seem surprising, but at that time, the best emulators were on Nintendo's Virtual Console, even though they lacked some of the more advanced features seen in community-made emulators. Furthermore, since the Wii and DS used specific hardware features like a touchscreen, microphone, dual screens for the DS, and motion sensors for the Wii, and most of the games revolved around these features, emulators for these consoles lost much of their appeal. However, one emulator had a massive impact: No Cache GBA. The No Cache series of emulators was developed by Martin Korth, and in the mid-2000s he began studying the Nintendo DS because he wanted to offer emulation for that console in his No Cache GBA emulator. In mid-2006, Martin Korth managed to understand how the DS console works, but more importantly, he figured out what its BIOS does. He documented everything he found online, making it accessible to everyone. It seems that this work, along with some early primitive hacks, is what led to the creation of flashcards like the R4, Ace Card, and M3, which allow players to run all DS games on the console via the ROMs. At the same time, the Wii also got hacked thanks to a pair of tweezers and an exploit in the save file of Zelda Twilight Princess. This further reduced the relevance of emulators, and it pushed Nintendo to shut down many ROM sites and pursue even more aggressive legal actions, scaring off emulator programmers even more. Ironically, the hacking of the DS and Wii consoles spurred the development of emulators for consoles. One of the main benefits of owning a hacked console is being able to install emulators, so versions of these emulators were created specifically for these systems. You might think that this would lead to advancements in emulators for older consoles, but that wasn't the case. For instance, in 2004, a specialized magazine was still recommending Ultra HLE, which had been released 5 years earlier and was only compatible with a small portion of the Nintendo 64's game library. Even though other emulators had come out since then, like Project 64, 1964, or Blade 64, none of them stood out, and they all had problems and evolved very slowly. The 2000s also marked a time when, due to the widespread hacking of consoles, many games started integrating anti-piracy measures. One of the most famous examples was Pokémon Heart Gold and Soul Silver, where for weeks nobody could find a fully working ROM. Either the game crashed after obtaining the first badge, or the Pokéballs would spin endlessly. Naturally, this discouraged people from using emulators, and many other games had similar protections that emulators couldn't bypass for a long time. There was so much demand for functional ROMs that many forums were flooded with threads dedicated to finding them, especially for Pokémon. At one point, it became forbidden on several forums to even create threads on this topic. However, the 2000s also saw the rise of a new trend: the distribution of strange files alongside official games, modified ROMs, also known as ROM hacks. ROM hacks helped sustain the emulator scene during the 2000s, particularly in a few notable cases. Fans started translating games that had never been released in certain regions of the world and sharing them online, allowing players to discover some very obscure titles. Additionally, ROM hacks that altered gameplay or the design of games became increasingly popular. One of these became so famous that it launched an entire trend: Kaizo Mario World. In 2007, a user named Takimoto shared a modified ROM of Super Mario World that he had created for his friend Kiba. It featured much harder levels, but more importantly, broke the conventions of level design typically found in Mario games. It became so popular that Takimoto made a Kaizo Mario World 2 and 3, and the term Kaizo became part of video game vocabulary. Initially, it referred to ROM hacks of any kind, but later, it specifically described hacks with extremely high difficulty and unconventional design. Although ROM hacks had existed before, Kaizo Mario World's popularity sparked a trend of creating ROM hacks. For instance, Pokémon Team Rocket Edition allowed players to become a member of Team Rocket and change the events of Pokémon Red and Blue. It gained attention, and then Pokémon Ash Gray appeared, a ROM hack of Pokémon Fire Red that followed the events of the Pokémon anime and introduced many changes. This hack became wildly popular as well, further intensifying the ROM hack trend. By the late 2000s, Super Mario 64 Star Road was released, a ROM hack of Super Mario 64 that replaced all the game's levels with new ones, added new game mechanics, music, and more challenging levels. This hack quickly gained an incredible amount of popularity too. A massive wave of ROM hacks emerged, with tools being created specifically to make them, and these ROM hacks could only be played on emulators. This gave emulators a new purpose and generated significant interest among players. These unique gameplay experiences could not be found on Nintendo's Virtual Console. They were only accessible through so-called clandestine emulation, and this surge in the popularity of ROM hacks re-motivated developers to work on emulators and improve those for older consoles. By the late 2000s, emulation seemed to be rising from the ashes and regaining interest. Projects like DS-EMU, for example, which had been abandoned by Yop Yop, were revived by new developers coming together. The rise of video sharing platforms like YouTube also encouraged players to showcase their discoveries, which was much easier to do with emulators. The spread of the internet during the 2000s naturally brought more players to the world of emulation. Momentum was building, and indeed, in the years to come, emulation would experience a sudden resurgence, becoming so popular that it would once again create problems. The late 2000s and early 2010s marked a significant turning point for emulation because it was during this time that several emulators became open source, meaning that anyone could contribute to their development. All the years spent improving and working on these emulators started to pay off, and 2011 was a remarkable year for emulation. That year saw the release of Dolphin version 3.0, a fully developed version that ran on most computers with support for GameCube and Wii, featuring multiplayer capabilities and greater ease in configuration. It was an impressive leap compared to previous versions. In the same year, Project 64 version 1.6 was released, a version still widely used today, which marked a turning point with more accurate, faster emulation and, most importantly, compatibility with most games. This emulator could emulate various accessories and had far fewer memory-related crashes. It was a real advancement for Nintendo 64 emulation, although still not perfect, with Muppin 64 Plus providing a popular alternative. Also that year, another extremely ambitious emulator finally reached a usable version, PCSX2. For a long time, it was thought that emulating the PlayStation 2 was impossible due to its emotion engine, which was very different from what computers used. Emulating a console typically requires a much more powerful machine, and indeed, for years the emulator's performance was poor. with games running at only 40% of their original speed, numerous graphical glitches, and crackling audio. However, in 2011, version 0.9.8 was released with a new user interface, better game compatibility, and most notably, it finally allowed most games to run at their original speed, even improving their graphics. This progress, combined with other emulators like PPSSPP, launched by one of Dolphin's creators, which quickly achieved notable results, and DSMEU, which also reached advanced versions coinciding with the release of new Pokemon games and quickly bypassed their protections. The early 2010s also saw more players switching to PC, with better hardware configurations. YouTube videos and guides teaching players how to install emulators also helped, alongside another growing trend that would significantly contribute to emulation: speedrunning. The early 2010s was the renaissance of speedrunning. Runners made impressive stats on Twitch, a small site at the time inspiring thousands of people to start speedrunning. With older consoles and games being hard to find in good condition, emulation became a viable alternative. Furthermore, emulators made it easy to practice with features like save states. They also allowed players to discover new routes more easily, find glitches and bugs more efficiently. Speedrunning became closely tied to emulation, and with emulators finally reaching more polished, easier-to-run versions, YouTube videos showcasing the games, encouraging emulation, and speedrunning growing year by year, emulation exploded in popularity. Tens of thousands of downloads, dedicated forums, and more frequent updates to emulators fueled this resurgence. Emulation started becoming more legitimate, to the point where gaming websites and even more general tech news outlets began covering it. This was a renaissance for emulation, which benefited from this growing community aspect to once again reach the mainstream. Simultaneously, a team called LibRetro gradually started bringing together emulators into a single software platform, RetroArch. This had the significant advantage of simplifying emulator configuration, controller support, enhanced audio with filters, and net play for multiplayer. Over the years, RetroArch grew into a large project that contributed to the advancement of emulation. In addition to improving speed, compatibility, ease of use, and facilitating the creation of ROM hacks, emulators began focusing on improving games in several ways. First, graphically, with higher resolutions, enhanced sound effects, and specific fixes to resolve game issues. However, two features stood out the most. The first was online multiplayer. Emulators like Dolphin and Project 64 replaced local multiplayer, where everyone plays on the same console, with online play using the same emulator. Coupled with vastly improved internet connections, this brought a new dimension to emulators, which until then had primarily been used for solo gaming experiences. The second standout feature was the use of texture packs and shaders, which became very noticeable as they dramatically enhanced the graphical quality of games. Texture packs for games like Mario Sunshine or Zelda Wind Waker became very popular, especially highlighted in YouTube videos. This feature wasn't available in official emulators from Nintendo or Sony, which further cemented the fact that the best emulators were no longer the official ones or those found in virtual consoles, but those available online. Additionally, by this time, the Wii U had arrived, and its virtual console was far inferior to the Wii's. The emulators were no longer optimized for each game, but were instead more generic versions that were hit or miss depending on the game. Yet it wasn't on PC where emulators truly shined. With the popularization of smartphones in the early 2010s and the fact that emulators were allowed on Android, the most widely used mobile operating system, emulators became hugely popular despite their apparent shortcomings like touch controls, lower performance, slowdown issues, and crashes. Even so, they gained massive traction, often coupled with Pokemon games where touch controls weren't as problematic. These emulators quickly reached staggering download numbers, often surpassing millions, tens of millions, and sometimes even hundreds of millions of downloads. Bluetooth controllers were sold to enhance the emulator experience, and some emulators even exploited security issues in Apple products to install themselves, despite being banned from the App Store. Emulators became far more mainstream and reached a massive audience, not always centered around gaming. Where they once seemed targeted at nostalgic gamers or enthusiasts wanting to discover or rediscover legendary games, they now catered to a much more diverse crowd, which, unsurprisingly, upset console manufacturers, especially Nintendo, because they directly overshadowed the Virtual Console. By the 2010s, emulation was everywhere. Emulators were no longer controversial programs, relegated to the fringes of the internet. They had fully integrated into the gaming world and were widely used by players and even manufacturers. In the mid-2010s, Nintendo capitalized on this trend, releasing the NES Classic Mini, followed by the SNES Classic Mini, which was soon followed by similar products from Sony with the PlayStation Classic. And ironically, the PlayStation Classic used an open-source PlayStation emulator. Other similar products included the Neo Geo Mini and the PC Engine Mini. And all these products relied on emulation. An emulator and integrated ROMs allowed players to relive legendary games, accompanied by aesthetic efforts to replicate the original consoles and controllers of that era. Nintendo also utilized emulation in its new console, the Nintendo Switch, tying it to the online service. First, it launched with a virtual console for NES games, then added Super NES games. On October 25, 2021, Nintendo further expanded the Virtual Console, adding support for the Nintendo 64 and Mega Drive. However, this sparked controversy due to the poor quality of the Nintendo 64 emulator. There were texture issues, online play didn't work well, many graphical effects were missing, and there was significant input lag. Since access required paying for the premium version of the online subscription, players felt cheated and angry. There was a significant decline in quality between the Wii's Virtual Console and the Switch's version. While this would improve somewhat over time, the controversy continued, especially since around the same time, Nintendo released Mario 3D All-Stars, a compilation of Super Mario 64, Super Mario Sunshine, and Super Mario Galaxy. This compilation was sold as a limited-time release, available for only a set period at a price of $60, which many found hard to accept. At this point, players quickly realized that Super Mario 3D All-Stars was essentially just an emulation of the three games, and to them it seemed like Nintendo was charging an exorbitant price for something that required minimal effort. There were no significant additions or fixes, no corrections to Mario Sunshine's widely criticized blue coin system, no addressing of the flaws Shigeru Miyamoto himself had pointed out about Sunshine in interviews, nor any improvements in Mario 64's camera issues or invisible walls. There was no new content, just emulators and ROMs sold at the price of a brand new game. To many players, this was the breaking point. Nintendo's credibility in its ongoing battle against emulators took a major hit. On one hand, they condemned emulators as tools for mass piracy. On the other hand, they used them for dubious commercial practices. Critics argued that the way emulators were used by rights holders like Nintendo was simply to resell the same games over and over again. For instance, you could play Ocarina of Time on the Nintendo 64, but if you wanted to replay it on the GameCube, you had to repurchase it as part of Wind Waker's Collector's Edition. Later, if you wanted to play it on the Wii, you'd have to buy it again via the Virtual Console for $10. Then do the same for the Wii U, and now on the Switch, you have to subscribe to the expansion pack for the online service. This cycle seemed endless. Coupled with the declining quality of Nintendo's emulators over time, many players felt that community-made emulators found on the internet offered far better quality than anything Nintendo was putting out. In the 2000s, since the Wii's emulators were superior and the console was easy to hack, traditional PC emulators had lost much of their appeal. But now, that was no longer the case. The late 2010s marked a new turning point in emulation. Two controversial emulators, Cemu and Citra, appeared, respectively emulating the Wii U and 3DS. They were controversial because they quickly reached a level where they could emulate games that were still being sold, but with enhanced graphical quality. Citra could soon run 3DS games in HD, offering much higher resolution than the original handheld console, and Cemu did the same for Wii U games. By the end of their console life cycles, these emulators hadn't really overshadowed the hardware, but they still posed a significant problem for Nintendo. Then another emulator took this issue to a whole new level, Yuzu, the Nintendo Switch emulator. Yuzu was developed by the same team behind Citra, and initially games ran with many issues, poor performance, etc. However, the emulator improved at an astounding rate, and soon after its release in 2018, articles began expressing concern and surprise at how Yuzu could already play recently released Switch games. This concern only intensified as the emulator continued to improve. By the end of 2020, Yuzu added online multiplayer support. though it quickly retracted this feature after a backlash about a paid subscription service for the feature, signaling its ambition to eventually replace the Switch. Then, in a surprising turn of events, on October 8, 2021, Metroid Dread was released alongside the new OLED model of the Switch. This game was meant to showcase the graphical capabilities of the new hardware, particularly its improved screen. However, on the same day, Yuzu released an update allowing players to run Metroid Dread with even better quality than on the new Switch model. As the months went by, Yuzu continued to make headlines, especially when it was adapted for the Steam Deck by independent programmers, enabling the device to run Switch games. At the launch of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, Yuzu saw a massive surge in downloads, with the ROM for the game topping ROM sites with millions of downloads. Yuzu was now too significant to ignore, and it was directly impacting Switch game sales. On August 3, 2023, Denuvo announced a partnership with Nintendo to protect Switch games from emulators. Denuvo, the company responsible for most anti-piracy protections on PC games, was controversial due to performance issues it caused in games, and its strange operations on users' PCs. But even Denuvo wasn't enough to solve the problem, prompting Nintendo to push for a historic legal decision. On February 26, 2024, Nintendo of America filed a lawsuit against Tropic Haze, the team behind the Yuzu and Citra emulators, and Tropic Haze quickly capitulated, agreeing to pay a colossal sum of $2.4 million to Nintendo. This amount was based on the number of players who used Yuzu to play Tears of the Kingdom. Tropic Haze also agreed to transfer everything related to Citra and Yuzu to Nintendo, which promptly had both emulators removed from the internet. Although some sites continue to share them, Nintendo is still actively working to have versions of Yuzu and Citra taken down, even going so far as to delete site archives to make access much more difficult. In parallel, Nintendo also shut down many ROM hosting sites from various gaming eras. Websites like Emu Paradise, Love ROMs, ROM Universe, and many others either had to delete all their files or go offline altogether, even for ROMs of NES games dating back 40 years. Around the same time, Valve contacted Nintendo to propose removing the Dolphin emulator from Steam, which had been added just a few days prior, and this was swiftly done. Ultimately, history is repeating itself. This is similar to the time of Ultra HLE and Bleem, when these emulators allowed players to run PlayStation or Nintendo 64 games in better quality, sparking lawsuits from console manufacturers who had to take legal action when emulation appeared during a console's life cycle. Today, once again, the image of emulation is tainted, as it is closely linked to mass piracy, especially since Nintendo doesn't seem to differentiate between emulating a 40-year-old NES game and a commercially exploited game. However, what has changed is that this lawsuit between Nintendo and Tropic Haze, which led to the removal of Yuzu, has reshuffled the legal cards regarding emulators. Since the early 2000s, rulings in cases involving Bleem and Virtual Game Station, emulation was unquestionably legal. But what the US courts decided in this case is that an emulator could also be used to bypass copyright protection measures, making it a piracy tool. But why such a ruling, completely opposite to the early 2000s decision? This change is due to the fact that games are now encrypted. If an emulator wants to play a game, it must decrypt it, using encryption keys protected by Nintendo. The courts concluded that Yuzu was primarily designed to pirate Switch games. This has created a strange situation where no one really knows if emulators are legal anymore. Emulators themselves may be legal, but they are not allowed to decrypt games, yet game data has been encrypted for several console generations. This would imply that most emulators are illegal, contradicting all previous rulings that made it clear emulation was legal, but game piracy was not. We are now in a period where the legality of emulation is being questioned, and no one is sure whether it is still legal or not. I even contacted 2 lawyers for this video, and they had a hard time telling me definitively whether emulation is legal or not in Europe or the US. They explained that the legislation is too vague to be sure if it's legal or illegal, depending on the situation. This might also explain why Nintendo hasn't shut down older console emulators like Dolphin for the Wii and GameCube, or even other emulators for more recent consoles. After this legal ruling, Apple did something quite unusual. After banning emulators from the App Store since 2008, Apple started allowing them again in the App Store 16 years later. Unsurprisingly, emulators have already started to appear, which recalls when Steve Jobs promoted the virtual game station emulator at Macworld 99. However, this decision wasn't made enthusiastically by Apple. In 2022, the European Union passed a new law, the Digital Markets Act, which imposed strict rules on companies like Apple. One of the impacts of this law was that it required Apple to allow its users to install applications from sources other than the App Store, essentially other app stores. The main reason Apple users might choose to use sources outside of the App Store would likely be to access emulators, proving their popularity once again. To discourage its users from abandoning the App Store, Apple began allowing emulators on the App Store, which, after all, aligns with Apple's growing ties to the gaming industry over the past decade. Ironically, this legal decision has led to a new rise in emulator popularity on platforms where they had never been available. Yet it also shows how badly emulators are perceived, considering that Apple had banned these apps since the creation of the App Store. Still, this move has not overshadowed the earthquake that was the Nintendo versus Yuzu case. And this couldn't have happened at a worse time. After the revival of emulation and its rise in popularity, a plethora of new emulators have emerged, vastly superior to their predecessors. Examples include DuckStation, which perfects PlayStation emulation, MGBA for Game Boy Advance, Melon DS for the DS, and major advancements in PlayStation 3, Xbox, and Xbox 360 emulation. Even the first PS4 emulators are appearing. We had reached a peak in emulation that had never been so widespread and respected, becoming tools regularly used by gamers without much moral dilemma. But all of this is now being questioned by recent events. What's paradoxical is that this is happening at a time when emulators have never been more important or had so many different roles. Since they first appeared, emulators have steadily gained importance in the gaming world, taking on crucial roles. One of the most important is the preservation of video games. Sure, titles like Super Mario Bros. Or Super Mario 64 will always find their way onto newer consoles, but that has never been the case for the hundreds of other NES games, many from companies that no longer exist. Without emulation, these games would have simply been forgotten and disappeared from history. This applies to all consoles, not just the NES. Emulation is what has preserved the history of video games, and it will allow you to replay the games you grew up with when they eventually fall into obscurity. The Virtual Console or PlayStation Classic are just exceptions, representing only a tiny fraction of the games from that era, and sometimes not even the most popular ones. Plenty of NES games sold over 1 million units, which was huge for the time, yet they've never been re-released anywhere. This ties into another key role of emulation, ensuring access to video game culture on a broader scale. We're talking about games that are no longer sold on consoles, that are no longer sold, making them inaccessible. Take Mega Man X3 as an example. It was a Super NES game critically acclaimed at launch, receiving good scores for its unique qualities. Yet a used copy of the game today costs $300, $400, or even more, and you'd also need to buy a Super Nintendo and an upscaler to play it on a modern TV, which would also cost several $100s. And none of that money would go to Capcom, the company that created the game. Emulation gives everyone access to such games. It's even worse for titles that never released in certain countries, of which there are thousands. These games aren't technically playable for us. In some extreme cases, prototypes or unreleased games are only accessible via emulation. And what happens when games and consoles stop working because cartridges, CDs, and various components have a limited lifespan? Eventually, there will come a time when no functioning cartridges remain, and the only way to play them will be through emulation. Emulation also makes it easier to mod games. Whether it's translating games that never released in our language, like Terranigma, which was never released in the US, along with many others, or adding content. For example, Mario Kart Wii is known for its high-quality, community-made tracks, created with tools and emulators, which wouldn't exist otherwise. The same goes for ROM hacks. Emulation is also intimately linked with speedrunning, as its tools allow players to practice on specific sections or find the best routes. Emulation also plays a significant role in understanding the technologies used in games, how they were programmed, and their technical limitations. This helps in better understanding games, as many design choices were shaped by the technological limitations of their time. Emulation, therefore, plays an essential role in understanding games. Even though nothing will ever replace the experience of playing a game on its original console, since that's how it was designed, emulation offers the huge advantage of enhancing games. The first thing that comes to mind is graphical improvements, which are much needed because older games were designed with much lower resolutions than today's screens. Without an emulator, the visuals would look like this, for example. There are also specific cases like PAL versus NTSC, where for a long time, European games ran slower, providing a degraded experience compared to the original versions. This can be corrected with community-made emulators. Emulators also make it much easier to capture gameplay footage at a much higher quality. Most of the gameplay you see on YouTube comes from emulation. Take a look at this comparison. This footage comes directly from a Nintendo 64, and this one comes from an emulator. There's a significant difference in quality, which clearly makes a difference for longer videos. Emulators play many other important roles, which is why they are both loved and hated and have sparked debate ever since they appeared. The main question is, are emulators tools for mass piracy? Can you call it piracy if a game is no longer commercially available? History tends to repeat itself when the conditions are the same, and it seems that the limit always lies with the emulation of current consoles and games, even though Nintendo's actions to shut down ROM sites leave a gray area around all of this. On the one hand, you can understand companies like Nintendo defending their interests. It makes sense that they would do whatever they can to shut down an emulator releasing patches for games on their release day, overshadowing their console and games. But on the other hand, emulators are far more than just tools for mass piracy. Besides being technically impressive, they play a crucial role in so many ways that it's unfair to reduce them to piracy tools. The community has found ways around emulation, such as recompilations that port some games directly to PC, like Super Mario 64, Ocarina of Time, and recently Zelda Majora's Mask, with visually stunning ports, gameplay improvements, and a great respect for the original works. But it's clear that such ports require far too much work to be done for every game, for every single console. Emulators remain essential for the industry as a whole. In the end, the history of emulation is the story of projects created by highly passionate and talented individuals who were first praised, then demonized, and emulators kept improving until their quality was so high that they started to overshadow the consoles themselves, something manufacturers and publishers could never accept, perhaps rightly so. But ironically, these companies have also started to use emulation, making it part of their business. The story of emulation is also the story of greater access to more and more games, whether legally or not. The history of emulation is the history of video games. Thank you so much for watching until the end. I sincerely hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like the video, subscribe, and share it. This is really important for the growth of the channel. It seemed crucial for me to tell the story of emulation because it's an integral part of the history of video games, even though we tend to forget about it or avoid talking about it, as it often leads to heated discussions. See you soon for a new video. Take care.